Hello, everyone. Um, One of the things that you'll need to do for both the midterm and the final exams for this course is to do Kantian and utilitarian ethical analyses. Some of the questions will ask you to demonstrate your ability to analyze an issue or a situation from a Kantian standpoint and from a utilitarian standpoint. So I thought it would be worthwhile. I think that you should be prepared to do that, but I thought it'd be worthwhile to make a video on Kant and Kantianism, and a video on utilitarianism, just to clarify, at least from my point of view, after all making up the exams, what it actually means to do a Kantian ethical analysis. We have done a very quick, cursory review of just the very basic principles of both of these philosophies. So what I say will be to a certain degree qualified. And what I mean by that is this: I'm going to say this straight up. A Kantian ethical analysis is an application of the first and second categorical imperatives. For our purposes, that's what a Kantian analysis is, and that's quite enough. This is not a class in moral theory. We're going in depth in Kant. So I think that it's quite sufficient to have a hold on what these two principles are and some notion of how to apply them. So, looking at the brief excerpts I gave you from Kant, what does the first categorical imperative ask you to do? It's in bold there. Canst thou also will that thy maxim should be a universal law? And that's step one, or it really suggests that the application of the first categorical imperative is a two-step process. Because if you look at that, can you also will that your maxim, your rule of action, should be a universal law? What that requires you to do, and no application of the first categorical imperative is really correct without it, is to determine just what your maxim or your rule of action actually is. That is something that many times people skip when they apply the first categorical imperative. The second step is to ask whether that rule can be a universal law. But the first step is decide what the rule is, and that can be quite difficult. In a real world situation, it can be there's very I think there are very few situations in which there's only one plausible version of what your rule of action is. Um, let's say that there's a guy who's got a job and he wants to advance in his job, and his boss, who's got a lot of say in whether or not he advances to a higher paying position, is a real bore. Talks about baseball all the time, which this guy can't stand, and is really not a terrible guy, but really just kind of a tiresome guy. And let's say that this boss invites the ambitious worker, out to dinner, and the worker accepts and spends the night humoring the guy, listening to his boring stories about baseball and his lame jokes, and pretending to like him and pretending to have a good time. But he's only doing it because he wants to advance at work, and he knows he needs to have this kind of tiresome boss on his side if he's going to do that. Okay, so what would be his rule of action there? Not really clear, right? There's several plausible candidates. We could say that the rule of action is that it's okay to pretend to enjoy somebody's company if there's something that you want out of that person. That might be the rule of action. Another rule of action, I don't know, could be, it's okay to spend time with people that you don't really want to, if it in some way now serves your interests. So they would all be different, but maybe they'd be revolving around the same central thing. But it's just an example of the step you need to take first. What is your rule of action? No Kantian analysis using the first categorical imperative can make a single move without deciding just what that rule of action, or what Kant calls in our translation the maxim of action, is. So that's really step one. Step two is asking whether it can be a universal law. And that is another very difficult thing. Right? How do you determine something like that? Kant has been accused of being kind of a crypto or a secret utilitarian because the examples that he gives, he seems to indicate that a rule of action would be disqualified from being a universal law if it had bad practical consequences. But that it doesn't seem like there's a lot of alternative to on what basis we would decide whether a maxim or rule of action could serve as universal law. I would say you're kind of on your own. Um, let's take the rule of action from this guy at work and say that his rule of action is that it's okay to deceive somebody about whether or not you like them as long as you're getting something important out of the deception. Could that serve as a law for everyone? Kant would certainly say no. Kant would certainly say that and that kind of deception would mean that people couldn't really trust each other. Everyone would be suspecting. Other people would say, well, nobody gets hurt. It's a harmless sort of deception. And as long as the person who's being deceived is never told, then there's no harm done. It's not a bad action. So it's not really clear how, frankly, we make the decision whether or not a rule of action can serve as universal law. It's really kind of up to you. But the important thing is you have to do those two steps. You have to decide what the rule is, and then you have to decide whether or not it can serve, whether you would stand behind it, really, as an action that everyone should do in similar circumstances. And I'd like to put it that way. Would you stand behind this thing with a straight face? I would say that as far as deceiving somebody, pretending to like them so you can get something out of them, I couldn't do it, but I'm not quite sure why. The second categorical imperative is maybe a little simpler, but I think is also quite difficult in application. It's based on the idea that persons have absolute value. You and me being persons, that we have absolute value. And so whenever we're dealing with a person, Kant says at the bottom, what's in bold, so act as to treat humanity, whether in thine own person or in that of any other, in every case as an end withal, never as means only. It's a rather negative thing, right? You're thinking of doing something and you're not quite sure if it's ethical. And you ask yourself, in doing this thing, would I be treating any person as a means to one of my ends rather than as an end in themselves? Am I treating somebody as a mere means? If I am, then I know that the action is not ethical and I shouldn't do it. If I'm not, then I would suppose the coast is clear and go ahead and do it because you're not violating any principle. But your act may not be a wonderful act, but at least it's not unethical. Right? This is a kind of a negative criterion that keeps us from doing unethical things. So that's in the simple on the simple level. It sounds pretty clear cut. I mean, don't treat a person like a thing. Don't exploit them. Don't use them in any way. Treat them with respect and acknowledge their dignity and importance. Don't treat them like an object or an instrument of your desire, getting what you want. Problem is, in the real world, how do you actually apply it? For instance, one of the things that's come up many times over the years talking about it with students is, well, what about hiring somebody to do a job for me or hiring somebody to work in a business? Isn't that using them? Because after all, you're hiring them only for the purposes of them doing a job for you or producing money for you in some way or another as a wage laborer. Isn't that exploiting them? Isn't that treating them like a thing as a mere means to one of your ends? I think there's some argument for that, but I hesitate to think that Kant would agree because then no one could ever hire anybody. So it could be that as long as everything is consensual and the person working for you has agreed to work and you are compensating them fairly, then you're not using them like a thing. But I don't think that's totally clear. But so it can be difficult to actually decide. I think that the second version of categorical imperative is a little easier to apply than the first because there's not this problem of articulating just what your rule of action is, but it's still quite difficult. And you just have to sort of make your decisions in applying this thing to, or these two imperatives. But Kantian ethical analysis is, in fact, an application of the two categorical